Let's start with a fundamental puzzle that every business faces. Why does a company like Apple design its own super powerful chips, but then pays someone else to actually put their iPhones together? Or think about a car company. Why would they own the factory that makes their engines, but just buy their tires off the shelf from another firm? This is the classic make or buy decision, and the answer tells us pretty much everything about why companies look the way they do.
Right. This seems like a simple question on the surface, but it's actually really profound. It gets right to the heart of why companies, as we know them, even exist in the first place. I mean, why isn't the whole economy just a massive gig economy, with millions of independent contractors all just buying and selling services from each other in one giant open market?
For the longest time, economists didn't really have a great answer for this. They kind of treated the firm like a black box. Stuff goes in, stuff comes out, and profits are made. But what happens inside? The management, the structure, where the company's borders even are, it was all a bit of a mystery.
And then along comes economist Oliver Williamson, and he just completely changed the game. He gave us a powerful new way to look at this problem, a lens that eventually won him a Nobel Prize. He said, look, if you want to understand firms, you got to stop looking at the product. You need to focus on something way more basic.
And that basic building block? It's the transaction. This was Williamson's first brilliant move. He shifted the entire unit of analysis. He said, forget analyzing the car or the iPhone for a second. Let's analyze the exchange itself. Every single time a good or a service moves from one stage to the next, that's a transaction. And that's what we need to study.
So what does that actually mean? Well, think of an assembly line. When the engine division inside a company hands an engine over to the chassis division, that's a transaction. But when that same company buys tires from a totally separate supplier, that's also a transaction. Each one of those handoffs is what we're talking about, and each one comes with its own set of costs.
Williamson came up with this fantastic analogy. He said transaction costs are basically the economic version of friction. They're all those hidden costs that slow things down. The cost of finding a supplier, negotiating a deal, writing up a contract, and making sure nobody rips you off. The whole goal of organizing a company is to minimize this friction.
But what's causing all this friction? I mean, why can't we just write a perfect, airtight contract for everything and call it a day? Well, Williamson argued it all comes down to two, let's say, realistic assumptions about us humans.
So on the one hand, we have what's called bounded rationality. And this is just a fancy way of saying we're not superheroes. We try to be logical, sure, but our brains can only process so much information. We can't possibly predict every single thing that could happen in the future, so our contracts will always have gaps. Then, on the other hand, you have opportunism. This one's a bit more cynical. It means some people, if they find one of those gaps in a contract, will absolutely try to exploit it for their own gain. It's not just self-interest, it's self-interest with guile, a little bit of trickery.
And here's the absolute key. It's the combination of these two things that creates the real problem. See, if we were super rational, we'd write perfect contracts, and opportunism wouldn't matter. And if everyone was perfectly honest, our imperfect contracts would be fine. But because we have bounded rationality, our contracts are incomplete, and because of opportunism, somebody might just take advantage of that. That's what creates risk, and managing that risk is what this whole make or buy thing is about. Okay, so if the goal is to minimize all this friction, we need a way to figure out how much friction a particular transaction is going to create. Williamson gives us a toolkit, basically a set of 3 dials we can use to measure the risk of any given deal.
And those 3 dials are asset specificity, uncertainty, and frequency. Think of these as the variables that tell you just how much trouble you might be in for. Now, let's break them down, because that first one, asset specificity, is by far the most important one.
Asset specificity. I know, it sounds a little academic, but the idea is actually super simple. It's just asking, how specialized is the stuff you have to buy or build for this one particular transaction? For example, a standard cargo van has very low specificity. If your business plan changes, no big deal. You can just sell it to someone else. But what if you build a custom-made machine that only produces a unique part for one single client? Well, that's high asset specificity. You're locked in.
The absolute best example of this comes from the early days of the car industry. Back in the 1920s, a company called Fisher Body made car bodies just for General Motors. They invested a ton of money in these massive, specialized stamping machines that were designed only for GM's car models, and this created a huge problem. Fisher Body realized they had GM over a barrel. They could demand higher and higher prices because they knew GM couldn't just go find another supplier. The friction was off the charts. So what was the solution? In 1926, GM just gave up on the contract and bought Fisher Body outright, bringing the whole operation inside the company.
Now, the other two dimensions just pour fuel on this fire. Uncertainty just means the future's a wild card. You don't know what customer demand will be or what new technology is around the corner. This makes those gaps in our contracts even bigger and more dangerous. And frequency just raises the stakes. If you have to do a risky transaction over and over again every single day, the odds of getting burned go way up. At that point, it starts to make a lot more sense to just build your own system to handle it, instead of rolling the dice on the open market every time.
So let's put it all together now. We've got the transaction as our starting point, we have our human challenges, bounded rationality and opportunism, and we have our three-part toolkit to measure the risk. Now we can finally solve the case, when to make and when to buy.
So how do we choose the most efficient path? When should we use the open market with all its competition and flexibility, and when should we use a hierarchy, which is really just the economist's word for bringing that activity inside the company where it's managed by bosses instead of by contracts? It's a choice between two totally different ways of governing a transaction.
This graph from Williamson's work really brings the whole idea home. Now don't worry, it's way simpler than it looks. That line along the bottom, that's just asset specificity. On the far left, you have generic, off-the-shelf items. As you move to the right, things get more and more specialized. Now look at that line that curves sharply upwards. That represents the cost, the friction of using the market. See how it just skyrockets as assets get more specific? The risk of getting held hostage just gets way too high. The other flatter line, that's the cost of managing the same thing inside your own company, the hierarchy. And right there, at point K, where the lines cross, that's the tipping point. Suddenly, it becomes cheaper, safer, and just plain smarter to make it yourself instead of buying it.
And that right there is the core insight of this entire framework. When you're dealing with simple, generic things, the market is amazing. It's efficient and cheap. But as your investments get more specialized and the future gets more uncertain, the danger of being exploited just gets too high. The friction is overwhelming. And at that point, it makes economic sense to bring that activity in-house. It is all about minimizing those transaction costs.
But this whole idea leaves us with a really fascinating question for today's world. Think about it. Technology, from platforms like Uber to AI that can draft and monitor contracts, is making it way cheaper and easier to deal with people on the open market. In Williamson's language, technology is reducing the friction, the transaction costs of everything. So does that mean that tipping point we saw on the graph is shifting? Are we headed for a future with smaller, leaner companies that outsource more and more? What does this half-century-old theory tell us about what a company will look like in the 21st century? That's definitely something to chew on.